I never thought a simple snowfall would turn my quiet life in Boulder, Colorado into a full-blown war with the most insufferable woman I'd ever met. But here we are, and honestly, I regret nothing. My name is Tyler Reeves, and I'd been living in the Mountain View Estates subdivision for about 3 years when this whole mess started. The neighborhood was one of those planned communities with identical beige townhouses, perfectly manicured lawns in summer, and an HOA that had more rules than the entire Colorado state legislature. I worked as a software developer from home, which meant I was around to witness all the neighborhood drama that most 9-to-5 workers missed. Lucky me. The HOA president was a woman named Brenda Patterson, and she was exactly what you'd picture when someone says the word Karen out loud. Mid-40s, shoulder-length blonde hair with those chunky highlights that were popular about 15 years ago. Always wore activewear despite never actually exercising, and had this permanent expression like she'd just smelled something foul. She drove a white Lexus SUV that she parked directly across from my townhouse, in the guest parking spot that technically belonged to my unit, but that she'd claimed as her personal space about 2 years ago. I'd let that slide because, honestly, I didn't use that spot much. My own car sat in my designated driveway, and I figured it wasn't worth the argument. That was before I understood that giving Brenda Patterson an inch meant she'd take a mile, your house, your dignity, and probably your firstborn if you weren't careful. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late January. We'd gotten about 8 inches of snow overnight, which wasn't unusual for Boulder in winter. I woke up around 7, made my coffee, and looked out my front window to see the neighborhood blanketed in fresh powder. It was actually pretty beautiful, the way the morning sun made everything sparkle. I figured I'd give it an hour for the temperature to rise a bit before I went out to clear my driveway. That's when I heard the pounding on my door. I wasn't even fully caffeinated yet, still in my sweatpants and old college hoodie, when I opened the door to find Brenda standing there in her white puffy coat, hands on her hips, face already red with indignation. "Tyler, I need you to come clear off my car immediately," she announced, not asked. Announced. I blinked at her coffee mug halfway to my lips. "I'm sorry, what? My car. It's covered in snow. I have an important HOA board meeting at 9 and I need it cleared off right now." She said this like it was the most reasonable request in the world. "Brenda, that's your car. You need to clear it off yourself." Her eyes went wide like I just suggested she fly to the moon. "Excuse me, do you know who I am? I'm the HOA president. I don't have time for this kind of manual labor. That's what community members are for." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. Community members aren't your personal servants. Buy a snow brush like everyone else. The HOA bylaws clearly state that residents must maintain a spirit of cooperation and neighborly assistance, she said, pulling out her phone and starting to scroll through what I assumed was a PDF of said bylaws. Section 12, Paragraph 4 states that homeowners should contribute to the well-being of the community leadership. That's about paying HOA dues and following architectural guidelines, I said, not clearing snow off your personal vehicle. "I could fine you for non-compliance," she threatened. "Fine me for not being your personal snow removal service? Good luck with that." I started to close the door, but she stuck her foot in the gap. "You're making a big mistake, Tyler, a very big mistake. I'll take my chances." I shut the door, maybe a little harder than necessary, and went back to my coffee. I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. Over the next few days, I started receiving violation notices in my mailbox. The first one claimed my garbage bins were visible from the street, which was ridiculous because they were in my garage. The second one said my front door wreath wasn't within HOA-approved color schemes, even though it was a simple evergreen wreath that matched about 15 other houses on the block. The third notice complained that my car was parked at a non-regulation angle in my own driveway. Each violation came with a $50 fine. I called an emergency meeting with the HOA board, which consisted of Brenda, a retired accountant named Harold Chen, who seemed terrified of Brenda, and a younger guy named Steve Morrison, who mostly just nodded along with whatever Brenda said. The meeting took place in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that smelled like old carpet and disappointment. "These fines are bogus," I said, slapping the notices down on the table. "This is clearly retaliation because I wouldn't clear snow off your car." Brenda looked at me with this sickeningly sweet smile. "I have no idea what you're talking about. These are legitimate violations that I've documented with photographs and timestamps. If you have a problem with the rules, perhaps you should have read them more carefully before purchasing property in Mountain View Estates." Harold looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Steve was playing on his phone. "I want these fines rescinded," I demanded. "Denied. Next order of business." Brenda shuffled her papers dismissively. I left that meeting with smoke practically coming out of my ears. $150 in bogus fines, and no recourse because Brenda ran the board like her personal fiefdom. I paid them, because the bylaws stated that unpaid fines could lead to liens on your property, but I was seething. Then we got another snowstorm. This one was bigger, about 10 inches, and it hit on a Saturday night. I woke up Sunday morning to that particular quiet that comes with heavy snow, where everything is muffled and peaceful. I made my coffee, looked out the window, and saw Brenda's white Lexus absolutely buried under a thick blanket of white. That's when the idea hit me. I got dressed in my warmest gear, grabbed my snow shovel, and headed outside. The morning air was crisp and cold, my breath forming clouds as I walked across the street to the guest parking area. I started shoveling my driveway, which was standard procedure. But instead of piling the snow on my lawn or making a neat pile at the edge of my property, I wheeled my snow shovel across the street and dumped each load directly onto Brenda's already snow-covered car. It was petty. It was childish. It was absolutely glorious. I spent about an hour doing this, methodically clearing my entire driveway and depositing every single shovelful onto her Lexus. By the time I was done, her car looked less like a vehicle and more like an igloo. You couldn't even see the windows anymore. It was a work of art. I went back inside, made myself a celebratory hot chocolate, and waited. Around 10 in the morning, I heard her front door open. I positioned myself by my window with my mug and watched the show. Brenda came storming out in her white coat, probably heading to another one of her self-important meetings, and stopped dead when she saw her car. Or rather, where her car used to be visible. She stood there for a solid minute, just staring. Then she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. Then she started looking around, probably trying to figure out what had happened. Her head swiveled toward my house, and even from across the street, I could see the fury in her eyes. I waved at her with my mug. She stomped across the street and started pounding on my door again. I took my time answering. "Did you do this?" she shrieked the moment I opened the door. "Do what? Don't play stupid with me. Did you pile snow on my car?" "I was just clearing my driveway," I said innocently. "Where else am I supposed to put the snow? On your lawn, on the street?" "Anywhere except my car." "But the HOA rules state that snow piled on lawns must not exceed 12 inches in height, and street disposal is prohibited because it interferes with plowing operations." I was just following the bylaws. I quoted the actual rules back at her, which I'd spent some time reviewing the night before, Her face was turning an alarming shade of purple. "You did this on purpose." I cleared my driveway. "Can't help where the snow lands," I shrugged. "Have a great day, Brenda." I shut the door again, and this time I locked it for good measure. I could hear her sputtering on the other side, then stomping away. Through my window, I watched her spend the next 45 minutes clearing off her car with her hands because apparently she still didn't own a snow brush. It was deeply satisfying. Monday morning, I received a violation notice claiming I'd improperly disposed of snow in a manner that damaged community property. The fine was $200. Tuesday, we got another 3 inches of snow overnight. Light, fluffy stuff. I cleared my driveway at dawn and deposited every bit of it on Brenda's car. This time I even packed it down a little, really made sure it was secure. When she came out at 8:30, she actually screamed. Like a full-on horror movie scream. Several neighbors came out to see what was wrong. "Tyler Reeves is harassing me," she yelled, pointing at my house. "He's deliberately covering my car with snow." One of the neighbors, a nice woman named Patricia who lived 2 houses down, looked confused. "But he's just clearing his driveway. Where else is he supposed to put it? On his lawn." "The HOA rules say we can't pile snow more than 12 inches high on our lawns," Patricia said. She'd clearly done her homework too. "Tyler has a pretty small front yard. The snow has to go somewhere." Brenda couldn't argue with that, not without admitting the bylaws were unreasonable, so she just shot me a death glare and started clearing her car again. I noticed she'd bought a snow brush this time. Progress. This became my morning routine. Every time it snowed, which in Boulder in late January and early February was pretty frequently, I'd clear my driveway and deposit the snow on Brenda's car. Some mornings it was just a dusting, barely worth the effort, but I did it anyway on principle. Other mornings we'd get several inches, and I'd create elaborate snow sculptures that happened to incorporate her vehicle. The violation notices kept coming. Improper snow disposal, harassment of board members, creating a public nuisance, failure to maintain community harmony. Each one came with a fine ranging from $50 to $300. I kept a folder of all of them and paid nothing. Let her try to put a lien on my house. I'd see her in court first. Other neighbors started to notice what was happening. A guy named Marcus, who lived across the street from me, came over one evening in mid-February with a 6-pack of beer. "I've got to tell you," he said after I let him in, "watching you mess with Brenda every morning has been the highlight of my winter." "She's completely unreasonable," I said, accepting a beer gratefully. "She's a nightmare," Marcus agreed. "She fined me $300 last year because my kid's basketball hoop was 6 inches over the property line. It's a portable hoop. We moved it back, but she still made me pay the fine." "That's insane." "That's Brenda." He took a long drink. "Half the neighborhood can't stand her, but nobody wants to deal with the hassle of fighting back. It's easier to just pay the fines and keep your head down." "Well, I'm not keeping my head down," I said. "She wants to play stupid games. She's going to win stupid prizes." Marcus laughed. "I'm here for it. Let me know if you need backup." As winter progressed, the situation escalated. Brenda started parking her car in different spots, trying to get away from my snow dumping zone. So I adjusted my strategy. I'd clear my driveway, then take a few extra shovelfuls from the community sidewalk, which I was technically responsible for maintaining anyway, and add those to wherever her car happened to be parked. She tried parking on the street, but the city plows buried her car every time it snowed, which was almost better than what I was doing. She tried parking in front of someone else's house, but that homeowner, a woman named Jennifer who apparently also had beef with Brenda over some gardening dispute, started doing the same thing I was doing. Between the two of us, Brenda's car was getting absolutely buried on a daily basis. The HOA board called another meeting in late February, and this time there was a crowd. Word had gotten around about what was happening, and apparently a lot of people wanted to see how it would play out. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only, which I don't think had ever happened before for an HOA meeting. Brenda sat at the head table with Harold and Steve, looking smug despite the fact that her war against me was clearly not going well. "We're here to discuss the ongoing snow disposal issue," she began, "and the repeated harassment being perpetrated by Tyler Reeves against myself and this board." "I'm not harassing anyone," I said from my seat. "I'm clearing my driveway. You're deliberately dumping snow on my personal vehicle." "Where else should I put it?" I asked the room. "The bylaws prohibit piling it too high on my lawn. They prohibit putting it in the street. They require me to keep my driveway clear for emergency vehicle access. I'm following all the rules." "The spirit of the rules is what matters," Brenda snapped. "No, the letter of the rules is what matters," I countered. "You can't fine people based on what you think the spirit of a rule should be. That's not how governing documents work." A few people in the audience murmured agreement. "I move that we amend the bylaws to explicitly prohibit disposing of snow on other residents' property or vehicles," Brenda said. "I second that motion," Steve said immediately, like the lapdog he was. "All in favor?" Brenda asked. She and Steve raised their hands. Harold hesitated, looking between Brenda and the crowd, then slowly raised his hand as well. Brenda looked triumphant. "The motion passes. Effective immediately, Tyler, you are prohibited from putting snow on my car. Any violations will result in a $500 fine." "I'd like to make a motion," I said, standing up. Brenda looked annoyed. "That's not how this works. You're not on the board." "Any homeowner can make a motion at an HOA meeting," Patricia said from the back. She was holding a copy of the bylaws. "Article 6, Section 2. "I'll second whatever Tyler proposes." I loved Patricia in that moment. "I motion that we review all fines issued by the board in the last 6 months for legitimacy," I said, "and that any fines found to be retaliatory in nature be rescinded and refunded." The room erupted in chatter. Apparently I wasn't the only one who'd been hit with questionable fines. "That's absurd," Brenda said. "All fines issued by this board have been legitimate and properly documented." "Then you should have no problem with a review," I said. "All in favor?" About 20 hands shot up around the room. Brenda's face went pale. "This is highly irregular," she protested. "But not prohibited by the bylaws," Patricia said, still holding her copy. The motion carries. The next week was chaos. Someone created a shared Google spreadsheet where residents could document all the fines they'd received, along with photos and evidence of why they were bogus. The list grew to 3 pages. Brenda had apparently been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank, issuing fines for the most ridiculous reasons imaginable. One guy got fined because his house number plaque was the wrong font. Another woman got fined because her mailbox had a small scratch on it. Someone else got fined for having a car that was too old parked in their driveway, even though it was perfectly functional and clean. The spreadsheet was damning. Harold, the retired accountant, actually came through for once. He reviewed all the fines with a professional eye and determined that about 60% of them had been issued without proper cause or documentation. We're talking thousands of dollars in illegitimate fines that Brenda had been collecting from the neighborhood. An emergency HOA meeting was called for mid-March. The snow had mostly melted by then, but the damage to Brenda's authority was permanent. The clubhouse was even more packed than last time, and people were angry. Really angry. "This board has failed in its fiduciary duty to this community," said a lawyer who lived in the neighborhood, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine. "The bylaws clearly state that fines must be issued only for legitimate violations and must be properly documented. President Patterson has been issuing fines without proper cause, which constitutes a breach of her duties." "I've done nothing wrong," Brenda insisted, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "The evidence says otherwise," Harold said quietly. He'd brought printed copies of the spreadsheet and his analysis. "I'm recommending that all contested fines be refunded immediately." "I second that," Steve said. Even he had apparently had enough of Brenda's nonsense. The motion passed unanimously, even Brenda abstaining rather than voting against it. She was done, and she knew it. "Furthermore," Catherine the lawyer continued, "I motion that we hold an immediate vote for new board leadership. President Patterson has lost the confidence of this community." "I second that," about 5 people said at once. The vote wasn't even close. Brenda was removed as HOA president by a margin of 48-3. Harold was elected as the new president, with Patricia as vice president and Catherine as treasurer. Steve resigned from the board entirely, saying he'd only joined because Brenda had pressured him. Brenda sat through the entire meeting in stony silence, her face pale and tight. When it was over, she gathered her things and walked out without a word. I actually felt a tiny bit bad for her. Tiny. Very tiny. But the story doesn't end there. 2 days later, Harold called me. "Tyler, we've been going through the HOA financial records in more detail," he said. "We've found some irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that might require police involvement." It turned out that Brenda hadn't just been issuing bogus fines. She'd been pocketing money from the HOA accounts. The association had about $80,000 in reserves for community maintenance, emergency repairs, and capital improvements. Over the past 3 years, about $30,000 of that had disappeared into various consulting fees and administrative costs that Harold couldn't account for. When he dug deeper, he found that the payments had been going to a shell company that listed Brenda as the registered agent. She'd been embezzling from the HOA. Harold filed a police report. Within a week, 2 detectives came to the neighborhood to investigate. They interviewed Harold, reviewed the financial records, and then showed up at Brenda's door with a warrant. I watched from my window as they searched her townhouse and eventually led her out in handcuffs. She was crying, mascara running down her face, looking nothing like the imperious HOA president who demanded I clear snow off her car. The police found evidence of wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Apparently Brenda had been forging Harold's signature on checks for years, and he'd never noticed because he didn't actually review the finances that carefully. He'd trusted her. Big mistake. The case went to court over the summer. Brenda initially tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her lawyer eventually convinced her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to embezzlement and wire fraud, agreed to pay back the $30,000 plus damages, and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. The neighborhood was stunned. Nobody had liked Brenda, but nobody had thought she was actually a criminal. Well, maybe a few of us had suspected, but not to this extent. With Brenda gone and the new board in place, Mountain View Estates became a completely different place. Harold ran the HOA like an actual community organization instead of a dictatorship. The ridiculous bylaws got revised, with input from actual residents. The fines that had been issued over the past few years were refunded, which cost the HOA about $15,000, but it was worth it for community morale. The guest parking spot across from my house, The one Brenda had claimed as her own went back to being actual guest parking. Different cars rotated through it, and nobody acted like they owned it. It was nice. Patricia organized a neighborhood barbecue in July to celebrate the new board and the return of sanity. It was held in the common area near the clubhouse, and practically everyone showed up. There were burgers and hot dogs, potato salad, and about 15 different desserts. Kids ran around playing tag while adults stood in clusters, drinking beer and talking. Marcus came up to me with a burger in hand. "You know, if you hadn't started that snow war with Brenda, we might never have discovered what she was doing." "I was just being petty," I admitted. "Sure, but your pettiness saved this neighborhood. We were all too scared or too apathetic to stand up to her. You actually did something about it." "I just didn't want to clear snow off her car," I said, "and look where it led." He raised his beer. "To petty revenge that accidentally exposes white-collar crime." I clinked my bottle against his. "I'll drink to that." Jennifer, the woman who'd also started dumping snow on Brenda's car, came over to join us. "I heard through the grapevine that Brenda's trying to sell her townhouse from prison. Her husband filed for divorce too." "That's rough," I said, though I didn't really feel that bad about it. "Play stupid games, win stupid prizes," Jennifer said, echoing my words from months ago. The summer passed peacefully. Without the constant threat of arbitrary fines, people actually started enjoying their homes again. Someone planted a garden that technically violated the old height restrictions for plants, but nobody cared. A few people painted their front doors in non-approved colors. One guy even installed a basketball hoop, and Harold didn't say a word about it. In August, a young couple bought Brenda's old townhouse. Their names were Daniel and Sophie, and they had a toddler who was adorable and loud in equal measure. When they moved in, I went over to introduce myself and welcome them to the neighborhood. "We heard this HOA used to be pretty strict," Daniel said as we stood in his driveway, watching the movers unload boxes. "It was," I admitted. "But it's gotten a lot better. The old president had some issues." "What kind of issues?" "The embezzlement kind. She's in prison now." His eyes went wide. Seriously. But the new board is great. Harold's fair, Patricia actually cares about the community, and Catherine keeps the finances clean. You'll be fine." "That's a relief," Sophie said, bouncing their daughter on her hip. "We almost didn't buy here because of the HOA reputation, but the price was right, and the neighborhood seemed nice." "It is nice," I assured her. "Welcome to Mountain View Estates." They turned out to be great neighbors. Daniel worked in construction and was always willing to help people with home repairs. Sophie was a teacher and organized a little play group for the neighborhood kids. Their daughter, Emma, was cute and friendly and waved at everyone who walked by. When winter came again, we got our first significant snowfall in mid-November. I woke up to about 6 inches of fresh powder and immediately thought about the previous winter. About Brenda and her demands and her car buried under mountains of snow. Part of me missed the pettiness of it all, the simple satisfaction of revenge. But mostly I was just glad it was over. I got dressed and went outside to clear my driveway. The morning was cold and crisp, the sky that brilliant blue you only get after a snowstorm. I shoveled methodically, piling the snow neatly on my lawn in a mound that was exactly 11.5 inches high, well within the bylaws. When I finished, I looked across the street at the guest parking spot. There was a car there, a red sedan that belonged to someone's visiting relative. It was covered in snow, but not buried. Just the normal amount you'd expect after a snowfall. I went inside, made my coffee, and watched through the window as the car's owner came out about an hour later. She cleared off her car with a snow brush, a normal person doing a normal task, and drove away. No drama. No screaming. No HOA president demanding special treatment. It was boring. It was perfect. Harold stopped by later that day to chat. He'd become a good friend over the past year, and we often talked about neighborhood business over coffee or beer, depending on the time of day. "I've been thinking about writing up a case study about what happened with Brenda," he said, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. "For other HOAs, as a warning about what can happen when boards aren't properly supervised." "That's a good idea," I said. "How many other neighborhoods do you think have board members pulling the same kind of stuff?" "More than you'd think," he said grimly. "HOAs can be breeding grounds for petty tyrants. There's very little oversight, and most homeowners don't pay attention until something goes wrong." "Well, at least our neighborhood learned its lesson." "Thanks to you," Harold said. "If you hadn't pushed back against those bogus fines, if you hadn't made such a spectacle with the snow thing, we might never have looked deeper. She could have kept embezzling for years." "I was just being stubborn," I said. "Stubbornness in the service of justice is no vice," Harold said with a smile. "Or something like that. I'm mangling the quote." We talked for a while longer about neighborhood business. The HOA had a healthy reserve fund again, with proper oversight and multiple people signing off on expenses. We were planning some actual improvements to the community, like upgrading the playground and repaving some of the walking paths. Things that would actually benefit residents instead of just generating fine revenue. As winter deepened, I settled into a comfortable routine. Work from home, evening walks when the weather permitted, weekly board meetings that were actually productive instead of being Brenda's personal power trip sessions. It was a good life, quiet and peaceful in the way that suburban life is supposed to be. I thought about Brenda sometimes, wondered how she was doing in prison. Part of me felt guilty about my role in her downfall, even though I knew logically that she'd brought it on herself. I'd just been clearing my driveway. She'd been the one embezzling money and issuing fraudulent fines, and generally being a tyrant. My snow-dumping revenge had just been the first domino to fall. One evening in December, I ran into Catherine, the lawyer who'd served as treasurer for the new board. She was checking her mail when I came back from a grocery run. "Tyler, I wanted to thank you again for everything that happened last winter," she said. "You've already thanked me," I pointed out, "multiple times." "I know, but I mean it." I was actually preparing to move because I couldn't stand living under Brenda's regime anymore. The constant fines, the power trips, the way she made everyone feel like they were walking on eggshells. It was exhausting. "I didn't realize it was that bad for you." "It was bad for a lot of people," Catherine said. "We were all just too worn down to fight back. You gave us permission to stand up for ourselves." By being petty and dumping snow on her car. "Sometimes pettiness is the spark that lights a fire," Catherine said. "Don't underestimate the power of refusing to be pushed around." As the anniversary of the first snow-dumping incident approached, Marcus organized what he called a freedom from tyranny party at his house. It was tongue-in-cheek, but also genuine. We'd all been liberated from Brenda's rule, and it felt worth celebrating. About 30 people showed up, crowding into Marcus's living room and kitchen. Someone had made a cake with 1 year free written on it in icing. There were speeches, mostly joking but with undertones of real gratitude. Patricia gave a toast about community resilience. Harold talked about the importance of civic engagement. Catherine made everyone laugh with a dramatic reading of some of Brenda's more ridiculous violation notices. When it was my turn to say something, I kept it simple. "I'm just glad we all stood up for ourselves," I said. "This neighborhood belongs to all of us, not to whoever happens to be in charge. Don't forget that." Everyone drank to that, Later, as the party was winding down, I stood on Marcus's back deck, looking out at the neighborhood. Lights glowed in windows. Smoke curled from chimneys. In one yard, I could see Daniel building a snowman with his daughter, both of them bundled up against the cold. It was a scene of peaceful suburban normalcy, the kind of thing you'd see on a Christmas card. It was also the kind of thing that Brenda had tried to control and monetize and ruin with her petty tyranny and criminal behavior. I was glad she was gone. I was glad we'd discovered her crimes. I was glad the neighborhood had come together to fix things. But I was also weirdly grateful to her, in a backward sort of way, because her awfulness had forced us all to wake up and pay attention to what was happening in our own community. It had turned a collection of strangers who happened to live near each other into an actual neighborhood with bonds and friendships. Marcus came out onto the deck, holding 2 beers. He handed me one without a word, and we stood there in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood settle in for the night. "Think we'll ever have drama like that again?" he finally asked. "God, I hope not," I said. It was kind of exciting, though, in a messed-up way. "It was exhausting," I corrected. "I'm perfectly happy with boring now. Fair enough." He took a long drink. "Although you have to admit the image of Brenda's car buried under all that snow was pretty great," I laughed. "Okay, yeah, that was pretty great." We stayed out there until the cold drove us back inside, talking about nothing important, just 2 neighbors who'd become friends through shared adversity. It was a good feeling. The rest of that winter passed without incident. Snow fell, people cleared their driveways like normal human beings, and life went on. The HOA functioned smoothly under Harold's leadership, handling the mundane business of community maintenance without drama or power trips. It was everything an HOA should be, and so rarely is. Brenda was released from prison in the spring after serving her full sentence with no early parole. She'd refused to participate in any of the rehabilitation programs, apparently, which hadn't helped her case. Her ex-husband had long since moved on, remarried to someone who wasn't a criminal. Her townhouse had sold to Daniel and Sophie. She had nowhere to go in the neighborhood. I heard she moved to Arizona, to some other planned community where hopefully no one knew her history. I didn't wish her ill, but I didn't wish her well either. She'd made her choices and faced the consequences. That was all there was to it. Life in Mountain View Estates continued. The neighborhood became known in the area as one of the better HOA communities to live in, thanks to Harold's fair leadership and the collective memory of how bad things could get when power went unchecked. People took an active interest in community governance now. Board meetings had actual attendance. Financial reports were scrutinized. It was engaged citizenship at its most local level, and it worked. I continued working from home, continued being part of the neighborhood fabric. When new residents moved in, I'd introduce myself and tell them about the HOA drama of the previous year, partly as a warning and partly as a story about how communities could change for the better when people stood up for what was right. Most people were surprised. Some were skeptical. A few were inspired. All of them appreciated knowing the history of where they lived. One afternoon in late spring, about a year and a half after the whole snow incident began, I was sitting on my front porch with a book when a moving truck pulled up to one of the townhouses down the street. A family started unloading furniture, and I walked over to introduce myself and offer help if they needed it. The father, a tall man in his 40s named Thomas, accepted gratefully. "We're moving from California," he explained as we carried a couch up to his front door. The HOA there was a nightmare. Constant fines, power-hungry board members, the whole deal. When we were looking for houses here, the realtor warned us about HOAs in general, but she said this neighborhood was actually well run. "It is now," I said. "It wasn't always. What changed?" So I told him the story. About Brenda and her demands and the snow and the fines and the eventual discovery of her embezzlement. He listened with wide eyes, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "So you exposed a criminal enterprise by being petty about snow removal," he said when I finished. "More or less, yeah. That's incredible," he laughed. "I mean, it's terrible that she was stealing from the neighborhood, but the way it all came to light is almost funny." "It wasn't funny at the time," I admitted, "but looking back, yeah, there's some humor in it." "Well, I'm glad we ended up here," Thomas said. "If the HOA is run by reasonable people now, that's all I can ask for. Reasonable people who learned some hard lessons about oversight and accountability," I said. "Those are the best kind." We finished helping them move in, and I added another neighbor to my mental map of the community. It was a good feeling, being part of something stable and functional. After all the chaos of the previous year, stability felt like a gift. As I walked back to my house that evening, I passed the guest parking spot where Brenda used to park her Lexus. There was no car there at the moment, just empty pavement and fading afternoon sunlight. It looked so ordinary, so unremarkable. Hard to believe it had been the center of such drama. I thought about everything that had happened. The snow, the fines, the confrontations, the discovery of the embezzlement, the trial, the transformation of the neighborhood. It had been a wild ride, triggered by nothing more than a woman demanding that I clear snow off her car. If she'd just been reasonable, none of it would have happened. If she'd just treated people with basic respect and followed her own rules fairly, she'd probably still be HOA president, still living across the street from me, still going about her life. But she'd chosen power and pettiness and crime, and it had cost her everything. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt glad that justice, in its messy and imperfect way, had eventually prevailed. And I felt grateful for the community that had emerged from the ashes of Brenda's tyranny, stronger and more united than before. Winter came around again, my third winter in Mountain View Estates. The first snowfall of the season arrived in early November, just a few inches of light powder. I woke up, made my coffee, and stood at my window looking out at the neighborhood. Everything was covered in white, peaceful and quiet. I got dressed, grabbed my shovel, and went outside. The morning air was cold but not bitter, and the snow was easy to clear. I worked methodically, piling the snow neatly on my lawn, well within the bylaws that had been sensibly revised to allow for actual reasonable snow disposal. When I finished, I looked across the street. The guest parking spot was empty. No car to bury, no tyrant to antagonize, no drama to navigate. Just an empty parking space in a quiet neighborhood on a snowy morning. It was perfect. I went back inside, poured another cup of coffee, and settled in to start my workday. Through my window, I could see other neighbors emerging to clear their driveways. Marcus waved at me from across the street. Jennifer was helping an elderly neighbor with his sidewalk. Daniel was already building a snowman with Emma before heading to work. This was what community was supposed to look like. People helping each other, following reasonable rules, treating each other with respect. It had taken a crisis to get here, and a petty snow war to expose that crisis, but we'd made it. And I'd never have to clear snow off someone else's car again unless I wanted to. That felt like victory enough. The months rolled on. Harold completed his second year as HOA president and was re-elected unanimously. Patricia continued as vice president, organizing neighborhood events and keeping everyone connected. Catherine maintained the finances with an accountant's precision, and nobody questioned a single expense because everything was transparent and reasonable. The neighborhood prospered. Property values went up, not because of strict HOA enforcement, but because people actually wanted to live in a community that functioned well. New families moved in, drawn by the reputation of fair governance and strong community bonds. People stayed longer instead of fleeing from tyranny and arbitrary fines. I stayed too, of course. This was my home, and I'd fought for it in my own weird way. Every time it snowed, I thought about Brenda and her buried Lexus and the chain of events that had transformed everything. It made me smile, a private joke between me and the universe about how small acts of defiance could lead to unexpected justice. Sometimes people in the neighborhood would bring it up, usually newer residents who'd heard the story secondhand. "Are you the guy who buried the HOA president's car in snow?" they'd ask, and I'd nod and give them the short version. It had become part of neighborhood lore, the story that explained why our HOA was different from others, why we paid attention and stayed involved. I didn't mind being known as the snow guy. There were worse reputations to have. 3 years after the initial incident, Harold announced he was stepping down as HOA president. He'd served his time, done his duty, and wanted to enjoy his retirement without the responsibility. The neighborhood held elections, and Patricia was voted in as the new president. She appointed a board of responsible, engaged residents who actually cared about the community. The transition was smooth. The HOA continued functioning well. The lessons learned from the Brenda era remained fresh enough that nobody got complacent. We'd seen what could happen when people stopped paying attention, and we weren't going to let it happen again. I ended up joining the board myself, serving as secretary. It wasn't a position I'd sought out, but when Patricia asked, I felt obligated to say yes. After everything that had happened, after the role I'd played in exposing Brenda's crimes, it felt like the right thing to do. Pay it forward, stay involved, help ensure the neighborhood remained healthy. The work was mostly boring, which was exactly how it should be. Taking minutes at meetings, handling correspondence, maintaining records. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal, just the mundane business of helping a community function. It was deeply satisfying in its ordinariness. Years passed. The memory of Brenda faded from immediate consciousness, though the lessons remained. People who'd been around during her reign still told stories, cautionary tales about what happened when HOAs went bad. New residents listened and took the warnings to heart, staying engaged and vigilant. I stayed in my townhouse, continued my work from home, remained an active part of the neighborhood. Made friends, helped neighbors, shoveled snow from my driveway in winter and piled it neatly on my lawn. Never once did I bury someone else's car again. Never once did I need to. The guest parking spot across from my house saw a regular rotation of vehicles. Visitors coming and going, people staying with neighbors, delivery trucks making their rounds. It was exactly what guest parking should be. Shared community resource, not personal territory claimed by petty tyrants. Sometimes on quiet winter mornings, coffee in hand, I'd stand at my window and look at that spot and remember the anger I'd felt at Brenda's unreasonable demands. Remember the satisfaction of that first snow dump. Remember the escalating war and the eventual victory that came not through my petness, but through the community finally standing up together. It was a good memory in the end, not because of the conflict, but because of what came after. The friendships forged, the community built, the lessons learned about the importance of civic engagement and holding leaders accountable. All because a woman demanded I clear snow off her car, and I decided to bury it instead. I regret nothing.